Well, so I grew up in Southern California in San Gabriel, east of LA, and I came up here to go to grad school at Berkeley. And then after that, I got a job down here in Silicon Valley. And sometime around late 70s, someone at work was a fan of the Mutants and a video volunteer for Target Video. And so he started dragging me to all these shows in the city, mostly Mutants shows, but you saw a whole bunch of bands, a whole bunch of art bands and stuff, and it was kind of fun. Saw Dead Kennedys and all. Totally missed out on seeing, the Avengers. But that's how I started. And then I was like kind of getting into writing cassette reviews and record reviews for Ripper, which is a fanzine that being done down in San Jose by Tim Tanoka. And I already was, a sort of nature photographer kind of guy. And he did all the shots for his magazine, but one time he couldn't go to a show, so he asked me to go take pictures. And that's sort of how I got into doing photos of the punk scene. Pretty much I only took pictures of things I liked, unless there were things that were really visually exciting that were also good. But it's funny. Sometimes if I was at a show, I would feel like I had a responsibility to be documenting stuff. And so there were, 2 or 3 bands that I couldn't stand. I would nonetheless take pictures just, out of the journalistic sort of side of things. I was into journalism in high school, so I had this weird sense of responsibility that I ought to be covering the event. So I started going consistently to shows that, if I'm to judge by the photo record anyway, I started going to shows consistently in '84 or so. It was funny, it was because it was like a East Bay San Francisco snob. I hardly ever went to shows in San Jose. So there's a whole set of shows, like I was hardly ever at the Cactus Club and never at the Red Light District, which were 2 places that had lots of punk shows back then, back in the, I guess, late 80s, early 90s. San Francisco was funny. There were spaces like Hotel Utah there were small spaces that art bands and whatever and punk bands played at. Like when I was first getting into San Francisco, it was the great shows were at the Valencia Tool and Die, which was a basement venue with sort of a speakeasy arrangement so that they could illegally sell liquor downstairs and be notified from upstairs when cops showed up and stuff. It was pretty strange because you were down in this little basement and that's where all the shows were.
Did you go to the Mabuhay or on Broadway?
And the Mabuhay and the On Broadway were great places. Yeah, saw lots of shows at the On Broadway. The skinhead thing was mostly at the Farm in San Francisco because I was just a kind of a big venue. So there were a couple of years where they were sort of at all of those big shows. It's kind of funny, they would show up at shows like MDC shows where they would be sort of verbally attacked by the band, and yet there they were. I sort of knew Tim Yohannan. I'm not sure if I had met him before I knew about Maximum Rocknroll, but he was as it happened, was an old record collector friend of mine, his friend. So that was my other connection with getting into the scene, was that I had another friend at work who was a serious record collector, and he had, a whole room full of 7 inches, mostly, all sorts of early stuff. And he also went to shows a lot. But he was a friend of Tim Yohannan's. Let's see, how did I guess I wound up taking a lot of pictures for Maximum Rocknroll. They printed everything. So I'd been doing a lot of pictures for Maximum Rocknroll, and I think maybe even writing reviews for Maximum Rocknroll sometimes. And then they decided to do a photozine, their first photozine, with my pictures. And so we collected them all up. At the time, I was printing everything on 4x5s. And so in the room of the Maxim Rocknroll house, we had all of these photos lying around on the floor, spread out. And there were about 5 of us, Tim and maybe Cammie and some other people, sort of collaborating at picking out the pictures to use. Because Tim wanted this or that, you know, I wanted this or that. It was a very democratic photo scene. Tim was like a classic sort of abrasive person. That was extremely opinionated. Seemed like went to great lengths to get his way sometimes, but after all, he made Gilman happen, and he made Maxim Rocknroll happen, and he made the radio show happen for years. Tim was always smoking.
So
what I used to do, because I printed everything on 4x5s, and then brought them in boxes of 8x10 Ilford paper in the back of my backpack to shows, and sold pictures at originally 15 cents, I think, and then 25 cents, and then 20 cents. It was kind of weird watching the price of paper rise and fall over the years. So yeah, so people would collect these things. And then right now, for some reason, there's been a sort of burst of people publishing my photos on Facebook that I haven't seen for, decades. David Hayes has been doing some, someone else, but a lot of pictures of East Bay shows. I started playing viola when I was in 4th grade, and played in school orchestra then and stuff like that. Gave it up in high school, then had a roommate in college who got me back into playing chamber music, quartets with him and his friends, and then gave it up for a while later, and then met a cellist who got me into this community orchestra here, the Peninsula Symphony, which I've been playing in for 26 years or something. So yeah, that's playing, all this stuff is classical music here, this lower half of the record collection, which is, and this is what I mostly listen to, in fact. So I wound up playing viola on some punk records, like on a Neurosis record and stuff, and then I wound up in a band with Tripp and Dave Chavez, Dave Mello, called Ding Dang. And we were a sort of country punk band with emphasis on the punk. We did distorted covers of all sorts of George Jones songs and stuff. It was a great deal of fun. We actually played the Bob Fest in, I think, 2005 or something. Played in Bremen and a couple of places in Holland. And currently I'm in the Shit Kickers, which is a country rock band or country punk band, punk in the Bad Religion sense, sort of. But we've been doing that for quite a few years now. It's a lot of fun because they have this large, devoted local following. So you go to shows and there's just a zillion people in the crowd, and they're all extremely enthusiastic. It's a lot of fun. Well, I was inspired by the Flipside slogan, be more than a witness, I think, be more than an observer.
That's a good one.
So I did want to actually contribute. No, I don't remember how it was that Tim actually got the idea. Well, I do sort of remember what the motivation was. The motivation was there were various places in Oakland and Berkeley that had started having shows, especially the warehouse kinds of shows, like New Method. They started having shows and then failed or got shut down or whatever. And Tim's idea was to create a place, first of all, that was all ages. Of course, all those warehouse places were effectively all ages. But create a place that was all ages and that was sort of shutdown proof, that was guaranteed in some sense to keep going and to be entirely above board legally, that sort of thing. I went to a Berkeley meeting, a city council meeting, when they were first trying to get licensed. And I remember Tim insisting that they should be no alcohol. And there were people on the city council who were very skeptical. Why would you want to do that? Why don't you want to have a liquor license? And Tim was, no, it wouldn't work. This has to be all ages. It probably was the same city council meeting that Kamala's father spoke at. I don't remember. There probably were a couple. They got us all together, a bunch of people, to come to the meeting so that we could contribute if we wanted to and see what was going on. I went to a couple of Gilman meetings, but especially since I was living down here, it wasn't exactly convenient to go to all of them. And
My apologies.
they had that, the Gilman meetings had that 60s radical meeting sort of quality where people were standing on soapboxes all the time, and it was extremely hard, it seemed to me, for anyone to get anything done. So it was very contentious. And then Tim had to be sort of there as the referee to try to make everything actually come down to a decision in the end. Ideally to Tim's decision, but to some decision in any case.
Was affected.
It's often been said that punks are the hippies of the whatevers, right? And Gilman especially, probably because of Tim, but or because of the people who organized it, had more of a political focus than most venues, than any venue actually. New Method was probably one of my favorite places to see shows at. There were like Violent Coercion, the pre-Neurosis band, played their first shows there. Attitude Adjustment started playing shows there. Rabid Lassie. But then too, they had all sorts of bands coming through and playing shows. So it was a great experience. I really actually much prefer warehouse kinds of shows, or for that matter, backyard parties to real shows at places that look exactly the same every time you go there. That was an interesting thing about New Method, because they had shows in this room or that room. Sometimes there were openings in the walls that weren't there before, and so it was a different experience every time you went there. Early Neurosis was much more, faster and punky. Well, Violent Coercion was faster and less heavy than early Neurosis, and Neurosis gradually got heavier as time went by. Yes, from my point of view, I think Word is Law was probably my favorite Neurosis period. Not that I don't like them now, but what really stood out was the awesome cover of Joy Division's, what was that?
I can't remember the name of the song.
Yeah, exactly. I went to 3 or 4 shows at Barrington Hall at least. Saw Intensified Chaos do an early show. But they had a lot of touring bands too, like Social Distortion, back in their early days when they could hardly tune their guitars. They played a show at Barrington Hall. I don't recall Barrington as being, I don't know, especially wild. It was pretty much like any party kind of scene. Yeah, Ruthie's was a great place too. And later Your Place too, sort of down the street. The interesting thing about Ruthie's was that West didn't always advertise shows very well. It's weird because there were always flyers, but the GBH, for example, played a show at Ruthie's and hardly anyone was there. There were some awesome shows. I remember Jerry's Kids from Boston played there. That was just crazy. And the place was full for that. Fang was pretty much everywhere. It was kind of an unavoidable band, not only at shows in the East Bay, but at shows in San Francisco. They played the Farm a lot of times. And Special Forces was the same way. Sort of ubiquitous bands. So nowadays, we think, Fang, how crazy, what a great band. Yeah. But at the time, you saw them every third show or something. And so, wait, more Fang? No. Kind of like Flipper. I mean, the 10th Street Hall shows that Paul Ratt did in San Francisco, he almost, it seemed like he wanted to torment the kids by making them see Flipper. So you'd have, for example, you'd have a Circle Jerks show, and Flipper would be playing just before the Circle Jerks. So all these young punks would be completely frustrated, throwing things at the stage. It's funny, I tended to go to shows where I knew I would like at least one band. After all, I did have to drive an hour to get there, so although I would go to experimental shows just to see what was going on. There were those days in San Francisco, months and months, where the MAB was doing shows. There'd be like 3 or 4 shows a week that might or might not be worth going to. And I would sometimes go just for the fun of it. So there were all sorts of bands I saw that I didn't like, but nothing stands out in my mind. Yeah, well, speed metal, I could deal with. Funk, I don't like. There's a lot of popish or dancey new wave stuff that was going on that I didn't like at all. I'm not sure what it was about Ruthie's that was so endearing, but yeah, it was a good deal of fun. I don't know. I'm partly it was for the thing I mentioned, that you could have a show where GBH would play and nobody would be there, which would be much better than a show where GBH played and there were a trillion people there and it was all packed. So that part was cool. And there were a bunch of kids like DMR girls and stuff hanging out at Ruthie's. It was a very good scene. It was just sort of good vibes, pleasant place to be, to see shows. DMR was Carol DMR and a couple other DMRs. It was sort of a gang of girls in Berkeley at the time. I think it stood for Durant Mob Rules. Anyway, they hung out at all the shows and dominated the pit and whatnot.
So they were pretty rough and tumble.
They were not against violence or anything. Yeah, I was there before it started. I actually donated a fan to the Gilman climate control system because it was just a big empty box when I first saw it. I have some photographs of the first meeting with this huge space with empty floor and people sitting down, I believe sitting down on the floor, but it was like that, and it sort of gradually grew. The sound was not very good at start, and the sound got better and better as time went by. The walls started getting graffitied, and it was fun because it just gradually became Gilman. Everyone always asks me, don't you have pictures? I know that because there are people who hoard a couple of prints I did of the early Gilman meetings and stuff, but I have no idea where those negatives are. I don't remember when I saw him first at Gilman, but he had a record company, so that was cool. And he put out all sorts of good records of bands in the East Bay. So he was definitely an important part of the scene. And he consumed a lot of my photographs and put them in his records, so that was cool. Well, there were bands from all over playing Gilman, and from like nearby suburbs like Walnut Creek and whatever, I think. So it was a combination of little bands from the East Bay vicinity, and for that matter, more interestingly, from the Central Valley. There were bands from Stockton, for example, that you wouldn't expect to wind up showing up at shows in Berkeley that played there. So it was a combination of that plus touring bands from all over, sometimes mixing in the same shows, which was part of what made Gilman good, actually. I think the point of Gilman was to have a lot of diversity on the shows. In fact, at one point, Tim's opinion was that Gilman should not announce who was playing at their shows, that the Gilman Central Committee, so to speak, should figure out good shows, and people should just sort of come to Gilman as an act of faith that there would be something good going on. And there were novelty bands that, threw trash into the crowd or threw animals into the crowd or whatever. So yeah, there was a lot of diversity in the shows. In the early days, there was more experimentation, I think, at Gilman. And then as it became the venue and the crowds and sort of solidified, that was another thing. In early Gilman shows, you could have shows that were complete failures, basically, that nobody showed up at. That was part of the reason for the discussion about whether you should advertise who is going to be on the bill or not, and whether you should try to get bands that would draw as opposed to bands that were interesting to the people who were laying out the show. So gradually, Gilman's, I think, started getting more like a real club and less experimental. Sticky was a fun band. They were extremely goofy on stage, jumped into the crowd, and it was interesting having a band from San Jose, because there weren't a lot of bands from down here that were playing up there. There was sort of a scene down here and a scene up there. But Sticky was definitely Gilman associated. Well, before I saw Crimshine, I had known Aaron because he put out Comet Bus for ages, going to shows up there. And Crimshine is a very strange band. It has sort of popish features, and yet obviously it's not. I totally enjoyed Crimshine, and yeah. Comet Bus was just an awesome little zine, all laid out in Aaron's handwriting, and he would write about just anything. He would go to drink coffee somewhere and meet somebody and start talking to them, and then write up the experience later, or write about trash that he'd seen by the train tracks, or almost anything. So Comet Bus wasn't the typical fanzine that was bands, I hate society, blah, 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 It was actually interesting. Yeah, John von Zolowitz I had known from going to shows for a while before Mr. T came into being. Yeah, Mr. T was fun. I only saw Soup maybe once or twice, so I don't remember very well. Probably at Barrington, too. Yeah, so I was mostly going to punk shows and mostly in the East Bay. So the only metal band that sticks in my mind really is Sacrilege from from Berkeley, I guess, who were really a good band, but they played a lot at shows with the same shows as Neurosis or shows with Attitude Adjustment. So that's why I wound up seeing them. I didn't actually seek out metal bands especially. There was a donut store at the corner, at the Gilman corner, at the time, I think. Op Ivy, yeah, was the first Gilman phenomenon. It's a band that sort of came from nowhere and totally blossomed. So at their first show, there'd be 30 people or something, and then almost immediately the place was packed when they played. It was like a precursor to Green Day in that sense. I remember, I think it was Jake saying, speed ska, what is this? But it was, I loved it from the start. Well, in fact, that was maybe the reason that it was such a big hit in the Gilman scene was precisely the fact that the lyrical content was all, in some sense, serious, and the music was all happy and bouncy at the same time. It was such an ideal combination. He was just thinking the new owners were all into something undesirable, some sort of commercial, ill-defined, un-Tim Johannen-ish, direction to move Gilman in. But in point of fact, Gilman sort of continued, as Tim planned, continued on in its Gilman ways after changing ownership, so to speak. So there are people who didn't like Lou, but I'm not quite sure why. And what was his organization called?
Well,
the Alternative something.
Music
Foundation.
Yeah.
Which is what it is to this day.
I know, there's a certain Orwellian quality to that for some reason, but yes, it's actually an Asimov hatred. No, I think I have a vague recollection of Jesse talking about how he wanted Op Ivy to break up before, if it was going to become somehow a success or something, that a band should always break up before it became a success. There was that whole line in Maximum Rocknroll about selling out, and I forget what Jeff Bale's term was, but anyway, bands who became big and started not wanting to play shows where they wouldn't have a good crowd, started thinking like a real band instead of like a punk band. That's what's interesting about the metal scene in general, I think, is that you go to see young metal bands, they're all already interested in selling merchandise and getting themselves promoted and, hoping they become big. Whereas punk bands are still sometimes happy to just be playing parties and little shows for years. I think not exactly a political thing, but it's a social thing. The whole idea that, well, especially since that you are an alternative, you're outside of society or whatever, and therefore you shouldn't expect the trappings of success because, once you became successful, that means that you are playing to a more mainstream audience. And if you're a good band, you're not going to be playing stuff that your audience doesn't like. And so you will naturally start becoming more of a mainstream band. So there's a danger, if you take that view, there's a danger to becoming successful just because you're likely to get diluted. Yeah, there's pits and there's pits and there's pits. Like at the farm during the skinhead days, there would be like dozens of skinheads would come and swarm in suddenly and throw everybody off the pit. My favorite, I always thought that pointless large poles in the middle of the club helped to make a good pit. The counterclockwise-ness over the central agitator and it all made it all go so well. Like New Method had a post down the middle of it, and Tool and Die had a post down the middle of it. Gilman was where Geekcore got started, where people were pushing tricycles around the pit and throwing large balls into the pit and things like that, where the pit was sort of intentionally playful. But like Ruthie's pits often had people on each other's shoulders and stuff like that. Just general, mildly playful pit activity. I'm not sure Geekcore wasn't a sticky creation. I mean, the term or the notion, the use of the word geek. And so I'm not sure how it got started. I started taking pictures for Tim from Ripper, and so he was all critical of the stuff I did in the start and said, no, you're taking all your pictures from the same place. You've got to move around, take pictures from different places and stuff. And at the time, I was using the same camera as he was, which was one of those Canon little rangefinders with a, I think, 35 millimeter lens. And a little tiny flash that mounted on top of it, which, thanks to the brilliance of Canon, was actually automatic. That is, it adjusted the amount of the flash level. It adjusted the aperture based on the subject distance, I think. So all you had to do when you moved around is roughly focus. So that got me into taking pictures from different places. Like with the pit, in a way, the pit was a blessing, because if you went to a show where everybody was standing still and being a good fan and watching the heroes on the stage, then everybody was packed like sardines. And if you didn't start out near the stage, you couldn't get near the stage. And if you got near the stage, you couldn't move to a different place near the stage. But if it was a pit, you had this entire area that was sort of cleared out, and all you had to do was move around the edge of it to where you wanted to be. So in that way, the pit was a good thing. Stage diving was sort of a bad thing because flashes tend to get decapitated, or actually depeditated, get hacked off at the base. This is a just very unpleasant experience to see your flash smashed on the floor. And I remember one time, a stage diver getting his feet trapped in my camera strap and then thrashing around trying to make himself free. That's why you don't let your camera just sort of hang around your neck. It's much better to hold it in your hand. And I always wondered how it was I got so that I could just sort of hold up a camera and point it at something and be more or less correct. Because as learning, from the psychology of learning, you would think that with a 1 week gap between when you actually take the picture and when you see what resulted, that you couldn't learn from that to point the camera correctly. But nonetheless, I did get more accurate. And I was always shooting with wide angles and cropping a lot to get the thing I was taking a picture of, so I didn't have to be super accurate. I tried not to, if you look, I don't have hardly any pictures of people beating up people and stuff like that. Because I didn't want to be encouraging it, by promoting, by capturing images and whatever. I tried to be the joy of punk, take pictures of people having fun, or being aggressive, but not being jerks. Yeah, Jake called me the chronicler of the lost, which is interesting because really all of those people like Jake, Eric Comet Bus or something, were in a sense like the least lost people in the world. They actually had some point to their existence and knew what they were doing and organized themselves into niches in the scene and all that. All very purposeful and not especially lost. But on the other hand, if you went to a party and started taking pictures of stuff, there'd just be a bunch of people who were lost. So maybe there's something to it. Eric Yee and I formed M&E Records and put out the first Grimple LP when they first showed up. Because they were quite a phenomenon. They just suddenly appeared in 1990, I think, from New Mexico, and they were just awesome from day one. And they had done a 7-inch already, so we did their first LP. After that, I did a partnership, East Bay Menace Records, and we wound up doing about 12 LPs, I think, and CDs with various bands. We did a Grimple Logical split, and we recorded Working Stiffs. And we did a compilation that was actually a big success. So that was an interesting experience, especially because the M&E Records, according to the IRS, made money every year, despite the fact that it was actually, in reality, losing money. I never quite understood the miracle of that, but nonetheless, we did a bunch of records, and it was fun while it lasted. It was fun going into recording studio and seeing the whole process as an observer. Yeah, I loved going up on. Nothing is better than a summer backyard party with bands. And I'm not exactly sure why the eggplant things were so good, but they all were. There's always a nice full backyard full of people, and there were always bands that were good, and maybe that was it. And it wasn't in a normal place. It wasn't in an expected place like West Oakland. It was out there. Yeah, so it ought to seem to me that Crockett and West Oakland are the same thing, but actually it seems much more like being out in the country to drive the extra 20 minutes or whatever. Well, Jake was a phenomenon from the start. He's a very distinct, forceful personality, and lots of fun to hang around with. And so when he was in a band, that was just all the better. I remember this graffiti, I think in the Gilman bathroom, filth punks live the stereotype. And there was that thing, is Jake was sort of speaking this, articulating this punk mentality that you were supposed to rebel and you're supposed to be hanging out in the streets and stuff, even though at the same time he was sort of taking an ironical view of it all, which made the band all that more interesting. Plus, tossing razor blades on the stage and rolling around in them, that was definitely a good feature. The thing about Blatz was that they produced this impression of chaos that extended through their entire set. So it seemed like everything was falling apart and yet actually it all worked. Even when I saw the last reunion I was at, it was still the same effect. Maybe it was the punk rock Grateful Dead, but it was precisely was not a normal band, you know. It was definitely an experience. It was like sort of this avalanche of people writhing around on the stage and this strange wall of crazed sound. So Green Day was the second Gilman phenomenon, I guess, after Op Ivy, and the band that actually burst out of Gilman and onto the world stage. It was such a pleasing sound, even though I'm not a pop punk fan. Mostly not. Not that I don't love Buzzcocks and stuff, but it was fun seeing them, especially because I have these pictures of them when they were really, really young, playing in backyards and stuff. And then all of a sudden they play some little shows at Gilman. There were almost no little Green Day shows at Gilman. Green Day was almost immediately, it seems to me, like a big success, and the place was packed. I wouldn't say Green Day, interesting. I'm not sure that Green Day exactly picked up an Op Ivy torch. It's just that, because it didn't happen other times, it really is just Op Ivy and Green Day, the two cases where bands started playing at Gilman and suddenly exploded. And what, Matt in Rancid, right? I think Matt from Rancid said that he wanted to be able to live off of, have a band he could live off of. So there's definitely, that is definitely a contrast between wanting to be able to actually live off of a band and wanting to stop your band before you got to a point where you could live off of it, or before you got to a point of having to please your fans, having to worry about that, at least. I mean, obviously Op Ivy pleased their fans, but it was sort of just happened. And same thing with Green Day, really, it just happened. And then they continued on and doing, as far as I can see, more or less the same thing. So it's not clear in my mind that there's a question of selling out even. It's just whether you want to stop at some point because you want to be a band associated with a certain kind of community, or whether you want to keep doing music and you don't care what kind of community it is. I'm sure there were people who complained about them selling out or whatever. But I'm not sure anyone I talked to had that opinion. It was just, wow, they've certainly gotten big. Well, they probably were metalheads, but yeah, my early pictures have them all with long hair. It was called If Life is Bowl of Cherries, Why Am I in the Pit, I think. We actually sat there in a circle, 5 of us or so, for a half hour trying to come up with some name for the fanzine. And Tim finally came up with that. I said, okay.
Pretty good.
It's not as bad as everything else we thought of. Yes, it was pretty good. There were a couple of shows at Owen's Pizza before that stopped. I didn't know, did Kamala start doing those? Not exactly an ideal venue because I don't think there wasn't a lot of space. So that was it, the trigger to Gilman, huh? Is that really literally sisters? I'm not sure. The Twisted Dog Sisters were Anna Brown and others in the scene from my day one. They were going to shows. Artistically oriented, definitely into novelty and stuff like that. So Anna has been after me for a decade now to put out a photo book, and So I hope I wind up doing that. It's not like the Twisted Dog Sisters were exactly a gang that was ruthlessly tormenting people at the shows. It wasn't another DMR. Econochrist was one of those bands like Grimple that suddenly arrived in the East Bay, were really good, and people kept going to their shows, and they became a fairly big phenomenon. They were sort of ubiquitous at shows around the Bay. There was a house where most of them lived called Little Arkansas, where people hung out. So it was both a band and a social kind of thing. Yeah, so Spitboy was like the most sort of concentrated feminist punk experience, which otherwise there weren't very many bands like that.
For Gilman.
Kind of the representation of, but there wasn't. It wasn't like it was a movement. There weren't a lot of bands like that.
Almost the soul representative.
Yeah. Let's see. The Ashtray was a punk house that I guess Jake Filth lived at. That was famous for the fact that people smoked a lot there, and so walking in the door was like walking into a giant ashtray. It was even more than Maximum Rocknroll House. It was a sudden smoke experience. So I gather the idea was to have interesting and bizarre things happen when you showed up. I'm trying to picture a phone booth at Gilman. It is true that, in keeping with the Maoist principles of equality and non-hierarchy, whatever, yeah, there wasn't a side room that was closed to normal people and that only Gilman staff could go into. In the early days of Gilman, that room was open, and that was where you would go and hang out if you got tired of being in the giant space with all the noisy bands playing. There is currently a wall of photos at Gilman, but I don't remember whether the side room used to have photos in it or not. Was that a Feeders thing?
No, but it sounds like it might have been. Right.
We found this baby, and it was certified, and we threw it into the crowd.
You were at that show.
I was at the Wonder Dog show, yeah.
I saw the picture.
And it was so incredibly controversial for weeks and weeks. How could they possibly have a band like that at Gilman? I certainly remember a lot of protest afterwards. Well, Fraggle had a house in 5th Street, I think, around Cypress, that did, I don't know, quite a few shows in the backyard. And then Fraggle's other house on Pill Hill was virtually a club for a year. They had shows all the time, which was a cool place, which later became where the Grimples lived, because they had this large hill going down by the side of the house and a huge backyard. So it was a great place to hang out, as well as actually a better place to hang out than see shows, because shows were kind of packed in a small space inside. Yeah, Genoa House was in Berkeley and did shows for a year, and like Fraggle's house in Pill Hill, the shows were all in an extremely small space, and then people hung out in the living room or whatever, which is a good way to have a show in a way. The band gets the advantage of the concentrated fans, and the fans who want to escape get to escape.
Come on.
What the fuck? Yeah, Sagicore was a pointlessly destructive phenomenon of punk rocks diving onto hedges. It was an op-ivy thing, and I never personally hedge dived, so I don't know what the attraction of hedge diving was. Well, what Rancid did that I think really worked was the whole catchy chorus thing that well, that sort of picks up a bit from Up Ivy. Just basically the catchiness and the whole crowd mob hysteria kind of thing of getting everyone together musically. Jawbreaker it's funny because recently someone posted on Facebook about how isn't it strange that all the young hardcore kids these days are Jawbreaker fans, and so I just don't remember them being that big a phenomenon back in the day. So it's interesting that they're a big nostalgia phenomenon. So it's like kind of a cleaned up Crimpshrine.
Yeah, when I think about it, maybe a little bit.
There might be something to that. As a photographer, I sort of hate it when bands get huge because then you have this whole crowd phenomenon that you have to deal with. And you have to go up to the balcony at Gilman to take pictures. Although I don't remember that so much from Green Day as from Neurosis shows, because at Neurosis shows, everyone is standing still, and so you can't get anywhere near the stage unless you camp out. But Green Day shows there's motion, so you can. I didn't actually know about the picture of myself holding a camera up on the cover of Dookie until somebody told me about it. I hadn't seen it, so it was interesting because people keep recognizing me even today. Well, you're that guy that, really, how can you tell? It's not as though it looks exactly like me or anything. I'm not sure that the huge success of like Green Day and Rancid, I wonder whether it actually had that much influence on Gilman, because Gilman Street, well, I'm ignorant, so I can't really say, because lately I've only gone to big reunion shows or whatever at Gilman and not, but looking at the list of shows at Gilman, it seems like Gilman is pretty much a small band kind of thing today. So it's not like Gilman has been especially influenced by it or affected by it. Well, everyone hates bands becoming big because they want to be that select group that knows that cool band that whatever. And although it's some consolation to be able to say, oh, I knew Green Day when they were small, since they were only small for a few months. I'm not sure what it all means. So it's going to happen that when somebody becomes a huge success that everyone's going to say, oh, they sold out. Or some people are going to say, oh, no, they're exactly the same as they used to be. They're just suddenly appreciated. And yet, I mean, the reason that you had the community still exists. And so there's still going to be people going to shows and seeing this or that band starting up. So in that sense, I'm not sure it has that much effect. I mean, it's not as if people who see Rancid and suddenly fancy themselves as punks are going to start seeking out backyard shows in West Oakland. It doesn't work that way. The community is always going to be the community, sort of. I wonder if there actually was something that was special about that era, or whether it's a phenomenon that happens all over the time, but it maybe sort of jumps from genre to genre, so that possibly somewhere in the Midwest today, there's this blossoming metal scene that is going to produce all sorts of stuff that we don't know about, There might have been some political thing that was helpful, that somehow the Reagan era, like made a lot of people realize the futility of politics and the hopelessness of the experience, and drove them into punk rock. And being in the East Bay, which was a natural political place, made that sort of thought easier. But yeah, I don't know, because then there was also the whole Pinole sort of Contra Costa experience that wasn't really that way.
What was it like in comparison?
Well, I mean, it wasn't coming from a, if you were a punk coming from Berkeley or around Berkeley, then you would likely have parents who were politicized and whatnot. Whereas if you were coming from further into the suburbs, that would be less likely, I would think. But it may be because of having the politicized hub that it formed a nucleus that everything could center around. I don't know, but that doesn't explain the whole Green Day phenomenon, especially. Green Day is sort of the classical it's how pop stuff should work. It's like teenage angst and good music all coming together. I mean, the songs are sort of about real stuff, and yet the music is happy.
Same with Up Ivy, you were mentioned.
Yeah, and the Descendants, say. And yet there's that spectrum from the Descendants to All where it kind of gets less good, but I take photos at the Rock Shop, which is sort of a large room in San Jose that with a pointlessly high stage that puts on shows. And there are bands that play, there are bars that have bands, Caravan, for example, or the Blank Club. Blank Club is I'm not sure, 300, 400 kind of person place, which is the main San Jose alternative venue. Lately, the last couple of summers, there have been just lots of shows in backyards, mainly in East San Jose, that are just a blast to take pictures at. There was this one place that had two shows. They had a swimming pool in the backyard, and they had the bands, and the second show they had the bands in a Battle of Bands arrangement, sort of set up on opposite sides of the edge of the pool, and kids moshing in the pool, while people skated in the pool, while people rode bikes in the pool. It was just, it was an excellent scene. The house was right along the side of the freeway, so there's this hill, there's cars going by, and that sort of show is good. I have gone to places in San Francisco, like the Knockout Club in San Francisco has had some shows, and the Elbow Room.
Find yourself at shows at Eli's.
And Eli's, although the back window of my car got smashed in last time I was at Eli's, so I have this aversion. You don't park under the bridge. Eli's is nice, though, because of having the back area. Well, actually, it seems to be an Oakland phenomenon. There, like the week or 2 weeks after my window got smashed at Eli's, there was a show that a bunch of people were at the Metro, where people got their windows smashed. Well, actually, 3 months ago, I guess, I got a Nikon DF, which is like 4 times more light sensitive than my D300 was. So I've started taking more pictures without flash and being kinder and gentler that way. And that is kind of a trip. It's because I do enjoy the sort of the Ouija look of flash straight in your face, but it is nice seeing the natural light too. The old photos, most of the old photos are with wide-angle lenses. So why does that work? I think because you're close enough to the subject that your flash is high enough relative to whatever, that it's not shooting straight into their pupil. If you are standing with a long lens far from the band, then you're photographing straight at them and the flash is straight in their eye, so you get the reflection of the red back. And now with the miracle of Photoshop, you can remove the red eye anyway. You've got to be more careful, unless you like blurs. Blurs are nice in a way, but if you actually want to see someone sharp, you have to sort of wait till they're not moving or till they're frozen in some sense. So drummers are more difficult.
Yeah. What did you ever go from shooting film to digital photography at all? And
that was 2000. Yes, it's less smelly. You don't corrode your sink. So yeah. So until I started doing digital in 2000, it was all Tri-X and T-Max 400, 3200, and I didn't buy bulk, but I did develop it all myself in my kitchen and enlarged it all myself, which is fun, but it's so much easier. And well, the weird thing with digital is you wind up taking so many more pictures than you would when you had these pathetic 36 exposure rolls of film. And it is good to be, if you're taking pictures with flash, then the light, if you're taking, if you're covering more than one member of a band at one time, is always screwed up. There's always something that is really almost overexposed and everybody else is dark, and you have to burn in dodge in the dark room. And doing all of that in Photoshop is so much more trivial and gratifying because you can reproduce it from print to print, which you can't do if you're actually making the prints yourself.
Okay.
Well, the hard part was if you actually got lazy and went 2 or 3 weeks without developing things and then didn't remember who all the bands were. I mean, nowadays it's trivial. You just go to the Facebook event and you go bam, 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 aha, got that. Or you can make notes on your phone what bands are which while you're taking the pictures. But back then, you had to have a copy of the flyer or something to figure it out if you had forgotten. So if I go through my negatives, and most of them have stickers on the top that actually name all of the bands, but some of them have question marks, and sometimes there's whole spans of like 6 rolls of film or something with no dates whatsoever. Yeah, so I would spend I guess maybe 2 days a week. So there's the developing. Well, so you can develop 6, 8, probably 8 would have been, because I had 2 cans of 2 reels, so 8 rolls of film in one night. And then going through and printing them would be a couple of days, a couple of nights. Put on the headphones, got a good CD. I'm not sure how I did this. It seems like there was a transition where for some reason I was shooting. Oh, I know what it was. So I was waiting for Nikon to come out with a reasonable digital camera was the problem. And that took forever for the D1 to come out in the crummy N80 body. But before that, there was a period when I was shooting negatives and developing the film and then scanning negatives and going from there. So I had a sort of hybrid phase, and then when the D100 came out, I actually had my first digital camera was a Sony point and shoot, And that was interesting. That was where I did have regrets because you couldn't autofocus in the dark. And there was this gigantic 1/3 second delay between, even if you had pre-focused, there was a 1/3 second delay between when you pushed the shutter and when you took the picture, which was totally unfamiliar with me from the film era. So I was glad when there were finally digital cameras that actually worked. I've been getting more self-conscious, and I think if I take more available light stuff, I will naturally progress that way. Of actually saying, wait a minute, I've got too many pictures exactly like that, and I have to wait till something different happens, and actually saying, yes, I want that person in the band to be doing that, or to wait till that part of the song and take picture. Whereas it seems like I used to be more reactive. I want to go for things being intense or for people being happy or whatever. Just sort of extremes of emotion or activity. And these days, especially trying for variety. Because, in the old days, like I have a million pictures of Benny Christ that are sort of exactly the same picture. And I think nowadays I would have had more different pictures. Well, because it's the Gilman ideology. That's just as much a part of the scene as the bands are, really. Because after all, it's not supposed to be a bands versus fans kind of thing. It's supposed to be all one community. And it really seems to me that in fact is how it is. And so because the bands wouldn't be there without the community. So the community is just as important to cover as the bands are.